Imagine this. It is November 1944. The Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly in every direction, dark and cold and vast. Somewhere beneath its surface, a lone American submarine creeps through the black water, running silent, running deep, her crew barely breathing, hearts hammering against their ribs. Above them, cutting through the night at high speed, is the largest warship ever built by human hands up to that point in history. A ship so massive, so heavily armored, so bristling with anti-aircraft guns that the Japanese Imperial Navy believed with total confidence that nothing in the world could sink her. She was supposed to be unsinkable. She was supposed to be invincible. She was supposed to change the war. And in a matter of hours, she would be gone forever, dragged to the bottom of the ocean by a single submarine that almost missed her entirely. This is the story of USS Archerfish. This is the story of the shot heard around the underwater world. And this is the story of how one crew of ordinary American sailors accomplished something so extraordinary that military historians are still talking about it 8 decades later. Before we go any further, before we dive beneath those cold Pacific waves and follow the Archerfish on her legendary patrol, we need to understand the world that created this moment. Because the sinking of the Shinano did not happen in a vacuum. It happened at the intersection of ambition and desperation, of engineering genius and catastrophic miscalculation, of a war that was turning against Japan in ways that its military leadership was desperately trying to reverse. To understand why the Shinano mattered so much, you have to understand what Japan was trying to do in the Pacific. And to understand that, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. Japan in the 1930s was a nation with enormous ambitions and limited resources. The Japanese leadership, dominated increasingly by military figures who believed in expansion through conquest, had set their sights on building an empire across Asia and the Pacific. They called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was a very elegant name for a brutal campaign of conquest and occupation. The problem was that Japan was an island nation with almost no domestic oil reserves, almost no iron or almost no rubber, almost no of the raw materials that a modern industrial war machine required to function. Everything Japan needed to build its military, to fuel its ships and aircraft, to manufacture its weapons, had to come from somewhere else. And the Americans, who controlled or influenced much of the Pacific, were the biggest obstacle standing between Japan and the resources it needed. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was not an act of random aggression. It was a calculated, strategic gamble. The Japanese military leadership believed that if they could destroy the American Pacific Fleet in a single devastating blow, they could buy themselves enough time to seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, particularly the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, establish a defensive perimeter so wide and so strong that the Americans would decide the cost of retaking it was too high, and negotiate a peace settlement that would leave Japan in control of its new empire. It was a bold plan. In some ways, it was a brilliant plan. But it rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of American psychology and American industrial capacity. Because the attack on Pearl Harbor did not break American will. It ignited it. Within days of the attack, American shipyards were working around the clock. American factories were being converted to war production. Millions of American men were volunteering for military service. The sleeping giant that Japanese Admiral Yamamoto had famously feared awakening was now very much awake, and it was furious. The early months of the Pacific War went largely in Japan's favor. They seized the Philippines, they took Malaya and Singapore, they captured the Dutch East Indies and their precious oil fields, they pushed into Burma and threatened India. The defensive perimeter they had planned was taking shape. But then came Midway, June 1942. For Japanese fleet carriers, the very same carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, were sunk in a matter of minutes by American dive bombers. For carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, gone. Just like that, the Battle of Midway did not end the Pacific War, but it fundamentally changed its trajectory. Japan had lost the offensive initiative. From that point forward, The question was not whether Japan would expand its empire further, but whether it could hold what it already had. It was in this context of growing desperation and strategic reassessment that the Japanese Navy began reconsidering some of its most ambitious projects. And chief among those projects were the Yamato-class battleships. Now, to truly appreciate what the Yamato-class represented, you have to understand the philosophy of Japanese naval planning in the years before the war. Japan's naval leadership knew that in a straight numbers game, they could never match the Americans ship for ship. The United States had a larger population, a larger industrial base, more steel, more oil, more of everything. So the Japanese decided to compensate with quality over quantity. If they could not build more ships than America, they would build better ships. Ships so large, so powerfully armed, so heavily armored that a single Japanese warship could take on multiple American vessels and win. The result of this philosophy was the Yamato class, and specifically the Yamato herself and her sister ship the Musashi. These were not merely big ships. They were the largest, most powerful battleships ever constructed. The Yamato displaced 72,000 tons when fully loaded. She was 863 feet long, longer than 3 football fields laid end to end. Her main armament consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval guns ever mounted on a warship, capable of hurling a shell weighing as much as a small car nearly 27 miles. Her armor belt was up to 16 inches thick. She required a crew of over 2,700 men. Building her had consumed enough steel to construct an entire fleet of conventional warships. She was Japan's ultimate expression of naval power, her secret weapon, her ace in the hole. But here is where the story gets truly fascinating, because even as the Yamato and the Musashi were being completed, the Japanese Navy was already beginning to doubt whether battleships were really the future of naval warfare. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been carried out entirely by aircraft launched from carriers. The Battle of Midway had been decided entirely by aircraft. The age of the battleship, which naval strategists had been predicting for decades, now seemed to actually be arriving, but in an unexpected way. It was not the battleship that ruled the waves. It was the aircraft carrier. And the Japanese Navy, having been the first to truly demonstrate this with Pearl Harbor, found themselves needing to adapt to the lesson they themselves had taught. This is where the third Yamato-class vessel enters our story. Originally, she had been laid down as a battleship, a sister to the Yamato and the Musashi. Her keel was placed in May 1940 at the Yokosuka Naval Shipyard. But in 1942, after Midway, the Japanese Navy made a momentous decision. They would not complete her as a battleship. Instead, they would convert her into something far more useful. They would make her an aircraft carrier. And they gave her a name that resonated with the deepest traditions of Japanese culture and spirituality. They called her Shinano, after an ancient province in the mountains of central Japan, a name that evoked permanence and strength and the enduring spirit of the Japanese people. They had no idea how deeply ironic that name would prove to be. The conversion of the Shinano from battleship to aircraft carrier was a massive undertaking. The workers at Yokosuka labored under conditions of extreme secrecy. The Japanese Navy did not want the Americans to know that they were building what would be the largest aircraft carrier in the world. She retained much of the Yamato-class battleship's armor, giving her a belt of steel protection that conventional carriers never had. She was designed not primarily as a frontline combat carrier, but as a support carrier, a floating fortress that would service and resupply the aircraft of other carriers in the fleet. She could carry a small number of aircraft herself, but her real purpose was to extend the reach and endurance of Japan's carrier forces. By the autumn of 1944, she was nearly complete, and the Japanese Navy was becoming increasingly desperate to get her into service, because the war situation had become truly dire. American forces had retaken much of the Pacific. The Philippines were being invaded. Japan's outer defensive perimeter had collapsed. The American submarine campaign had devastated Japan's merchant fleet, cutting off the flow of oil and raw materials that kept Japan's war machine running. Japan needed every weapon it could bring to bear, and it needed them now. So on November 11th, 1944, just 17 days after she had been officially commissioned, with workers still completing finishing touches aboard her, with a crew that had barely had time to learn the layout of their own ship, the Shinano left Yokosuka Harbor. She was headed for the inland sea, to the naval base at Kure, where she would be fully fitted out and her crew properly trained. Her captain was Rear Admiral Toshio Abe, a veteran naval officer who was under enormous pressure to get Japan's newest and greatest warship to safety. American aircraft had been photographing Japanese naval installations. American submarines were known to be operating in the waters around Japan. He needed to move quickly and carefully. He chose to travel at night. He chose to travel with a destroyer escort of 3 vessels. And he chose to keep moving fast rather than allowing his crew to practice anti-submarine tactics, because he truly believed, that the Shinano was too strong to be sunk by any submarine. That belief would cost him everything. Now let us shift our perspective. Let us pull back from the great drama unfolding in the Japanese Naval Command and descend beneath the waves, into the cramped and smelling interior of a Belau-class submarine on war patrol in the waters south of Tokyo Bay. USS Archerfish. She was nothing like the Shinano. Where the Shinano was the largest warship in the world, the Archerfish was a relatively modest vessel, 311 feet long, displacing about 1,500 tons on the surface, 2,400 tons submerged. She carried a crew of 72 men. Her commanding officer was Commander Joseph Francis Enright, a 34-year-old career naval officer from Minnesota who carried with him a private burden that few of his crew knew about. Enright had already had one encounter with Japanese greatness and failed to seize it. In late 1943, he had been commanding another submarine, the USS Dace, when he encountered what he believed was a large Japanese carrier. He fired torpedoes. He missed, or rather, he did not close to the range he needed, and the opportunity slipped away. It was the kind of failure that haunts a man, that replays itself in his mind in the dark hours of the night when sleep will not come. He had been given a second chance in command, this time of the Archerfish, and he was determined not to waste it. The Archerfish had departed Pearl Harbor on October 30th, 1944, and had been assigned a patrol area off the coast of Japan, near the entrance to Sagami Bay, which is the body of water that leads into Tokyo Bay itself. It was a dangerous assignment, close to the Japanese home islands, in waters heavily patrolled by Japanese anti-submarine forces. But it was also a potentially high-value assignment, because any major Japanese naval movement to or from the great naval bases on Honshu would have to pass through or near this area. For days, the Archerfish patrolled her assigned area without significant contact. The crew went about their routines, the endless monotony of submarine warfare broken by drills and watches and meals, and the occasional sighting of small Japanese coastal vessels not worth expending precious torpedoes on. And then, on the night of November 17, 1944, everything changed. At approximately 8:48 in the evening, the Archerfish's radar operator reported a large contact, moving at high speed, coming from the direction of Tokyo Bay. Enright came to the conning tower immediately and studied the radar trace. The contact was enormous. The radar return was unlike anything he had seen from a single vessel before, and it was accompanied by 3 smaller contacts that could only be destroyers. Whatever this was, it was big. Whatever this was, it was important, and it was heading southwest, roughly parallel to the Japanese coastline, at a speed that the Archerfish, running on the surface with her diesel engines at full power, could barely match. What followed was one of the great chase scenes in naval history, though it was a chase played out not at the breakneck speeds of an action movie, but at the grinding, desperate pace of machines pushed to their absolute limits. The Archerfish had a surface speed of about 20 knots. The Shinano and her escorts were making between 18 and 20 knots. For hours, Enright drove his submarine as fast as she would go, trying to get ahead of the Japanese formation. trying to reach a firing position before the quarry disappeared into the darkness forever. The challenge was geometry. The Archerfish needed to get ahead of the Shinano to position herself on a track that the Japanese ship would cross, close enough to fire torpedoes with a reasonable chance of hitting. She could not approach from behind because the destroyers were watching the Shinano's wake. She could not approach from the sides without crossing the paths of those same destroyers. She needed to get ahead of the whole formation and wait. And to do that, she needed speed she barely had. The crew of the Archerfish knew something big was happening. Orders came down to maintain maximum speed on the surface. The submarine was running in near total darkness to avoid being spotted by Japanese lookouts. The diesel engines were howling. The hull vibrated with effort. Men were called from their bunks to their stations. The air in the submarine grew hot and tense and electric with anticipation. Nobody knew exactly what they were chasing, but everybody knew it was something worth chasing. And then, at around 3 o'clock in the morning, the Shinano did something that Enright had barely dared to hope for. She zigged. The Japanese formation, which had been making steady progress to the southwest, suddenly changed course, swinging to the south and then to the southeast. It was a standard anti-submarine zigzag maneuver designed to throw off any submarine that might be tracking them. But this particular zig at this particular moment brought the Shinano directly toward the Archerfish. In trying to avoid submarines, Admiral Abe had steered his ship straight at one. Enright watched the radar contacts converging on his position with an almost dreamlike intensity. He had been in the conning tower for hours. He was exhausted. His eyes burned. But every nerve in his body was singing with focused energy. He had one chance. One shot. Whatever this ship was, however big she was, he had to make this count. At 3:17 in the morning on November 29, 1944, USS Archerfish fired 6 torpedoes. She fired them from her forward tubes at a range of approximately 1,400 yards. So close that the Shinano's lookouts should have been able to see the submarine. The torpedoes were set to run at a depth of 10 feet, intended to strike below the waterline, but above the bottom of the Shinano's armor belt. And now we enter those eternal seconds that happen in combat when time seems to stretch and compress simultaneously. The torpedoes left the tubes with a sound like giant fists punching water. The Archerfish's crew counted seconds, counted breaths, and then the first explosion, then the second, then the third, then the fourth. 4 of 6 torpedoes struck the Shinano. 4 massive explosions, each one hurling tons of water into the air, each one punching through the side of the greatest warship in the world. Admiral Abe, jolted awake in his quarters, rushed to the bridge to find his ship shuddering, listing slightly to starboard, flooding beginning in several compartments. His first reaction was confidence. The Shinano was armored like a fortress. She could take this. She would survive. That confidence would prove tragically, catastrophically wrong. Because the Shinano, for all her massive size, for all her thick armor, had a fatal flaw. Several fatal flaws, in fact, all of them stemming from the desperate haste with which she had been put to sea. Her watertight doors had not been properly tested. Many of them did not seal correctly. The compartmentalization that should have contained flooding to individual sections of the ship was compromised. Her crew had barely trained together. They did not know their damage control procedures. They did not know their ship. And when the flooding began, when the sea came pouring in through 4 massive holes in her hull, they were unable to stop it. In the hours that followed, a desperate battle was fought not between ships but between the crew of the Shinano and the sea itself. Damage control parties rushed through flooded corridors. Engineers worked frantically on pumps that could not keep up with the rate of flooding. Officers tried to organize counterflooding to correct the list, but without proper training and with malfunctioning equipment, their efforts were inadequate. Admiral Abe, realizing his ship was in serious trouble, ordered her turned toward the coast, hoping to beach her in shallow water and save both vessel and crew. The Shinano's escorts circled frantically, looking for the submarine that had struck this impossible blow. The Archerfish, having fired her torpedoes, had dived deep and was now evading the depth charges that the Japanese destroyers were dropping. Enright and his crew could hear the explosions, feel the shockwaves, but their submarine was deep and running quiet, and the Japanese could not find them. Above, the Shinano was dying. 7 hours after the torpedo struck, at approximately 10:57 in the morning of November 29, 1944, the largest warship in the world rolled onto her side and went to the bottom of the Philippine Sea, taking with her Admiral Abe and 1,435 of her crew. 1,435 men, drowned or crushed as their ship plunged into the depths. It was one of the greatest losses of life in a single Japanese naval incident of the entire war. When the Archerfish surfaced hours later, when Enright and his crew sent their contact report back to Pearl Harbor, the initial reaction was one of disbelief. The submarine claimed to have sunk a carrier, a big carrier. Intelligence officers studying the report struggled to identify what ship could possibly match the radar contact Enright described. They knew the Japanese had large carriers, but this was something else. Something bigger than any carrier they had on their records. It was not until after the war, when American forces occupied Japan and gained access to Japanese naval records, that the full truth emerged. The ship Archerfish had sunk was not just any carrier. It was the Shinano, and the Shinano had been, at 71,890 tons displacement, the largest aircraft carrier ever built, a record she held for decades until the American supercarriers of the nuclear age surpassed her. The Archerfish had sunk the largest warship ever to be sunk by a submarine, a record that stands to this day and will in all probability never be broken. Enright, when he learned the full truth, reportedly sat quietly for a long time before saying anything. 7 hours. The largest ship in the world had stayed afloat for only 7 hours after being hit by his torpedoes. A properly prepared ship with a trained crew and functioning watertight integrity might have survived those hits, might have made it to port. But the Shinano had gone to sea too soon, crewed by men who barely knew their ship, and the sea had taken her. Now, the story does not end with the Shinano, because I mentioned at the beginning that this was the story of a submarine that sank 4 aircraft carriers in 1 month. And the Shinano, magnificent as she was only the most famous of them. Let us go back and fill in the complete picture of one of the most remarkable months in submarine warfare history. American submarines in the Pacific War were not simply weapons of naval combat. They were the silent backbone of America's strategic campaign against Japan. They were cutting the lifelines that connected Japan's home islands to the empire she had seized. Every tanker carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies, every freighter carrying iron or from Manchuria, every transport carrying troops and supplies to the far-flung garrisons of Japan's island empire, had to run the gauntlet of American submarines. By late 1944, that gauntlet had become so lethal that Japan's merchant fleet was being destroyed faster than it could be replaced. Japan was being slowly strangled. But it was not just merchant ships that American submarines were hunting. They were hunting warships too. And in the autumn of 1944, as the American campaign to retake the Philippines drove Japan's remaining naval forces into a series of desperate counterattacks, American submarines found themselves in the middle of some of the war's most dramatic naval actions. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was the largest naval battle in history by the number of ships involved. It was Japan's last great effort to use its remaining naval forces to destroy the American invasion fleet in the Philippines, and submarines played a crucial role in its outcome. On October 23, 1944, 2 American submarines, the USS Darter and the USS Dace, spotted the Japanese center force, the main Japanese battle fleet, in the Palawan Passage west of the Philippines. The Darter, commanded by Commander David McClintock, and the Dace, commanded by Commander Bladen Claggett, launched a coordinated attack in the pre-dawn darkness. The Darter's torpedoes struck the heavy cruiser Otago, Admiral Kurita's flagship, sinking her so quickly that Kurita himself barely escaped with his life, rescued from the water and transferred to the battleship Yamato to continue the battle. Moments later, the darter's torpedoes also crippled the heavy cruiser Takao, forcing her to withdraw from the battle with her hull ripped open. And then the Dace finished the job on the heavy cruiser Maya, hitting her with torpedoes that detonated her ammunition magazines in a catastrophic explosion that sent her to the bottom in less than 4 minutes. 3 heavy cruisers in a single engagement by 2 submarines acting in concert in the darkness before dawn. The battle had barely begun and already Japan had lost 3 of her precious remaining heavy cruisers. It was a blow that significantly weakened the center force before it ever reached the San Bernardino Strait. But this is context for the larger story. The broader campaign of American submarines against Japanese carrier forces in the autumn of 1944 included a series of actions that, taken together, paint a picture of Japanese naval aviation being hunted to extinction. The carrier Shinano, as we have seen, fell to the Archerfish. But other carriers were falling to other submarines in the same period. The Japanese carrier forces that had dominated the Pacific in 1941 and 1942 were being methodically destroyed, not only by the growing might of American naval aviation in direct fleet actions, but by submarines catching their prey in transit, moving between bases, unable to defend themselves against an enemy they could not see. Consider the broader sweep of the American submarine campaign against Japanese carriers. The light carrier Shinano, converted from a German luxury liner, was sunk by the submarine USS Spadefish in November 1944. The escort carrier Jinyo was sunk by the submarine USS Spadefish as well, in the same remarkable patrol that saw Commander Gordon Underwood claim multiple major warships. The Archerfish herself, on the patrol that sank the Shinano, was originally assigned to a wolf pack with other submarines, though she ultimately made the famous sinking on her own when her patrol area happened to intercept the Shinano's route. The cumulative effect of these losses was devastating for Japan's naval aviation capability. Carriers were being sunk faster than Japan could train the pilots to fly from them. Pilots were being killed in fleet actions faster than Japan could replace them. The entire ecosystem of Japanese carrier aviation, which had been the most formidable in the world at the start of the war, was collapsing under the combined weight of American air power and American submarine warfare. By late 1944, Japan's situation was desperate enough that its military leadership was turning to truly extreme measures. The kamikaze program, the use of pilots who deliberately flew their aircraft into American ships as living bombs, was launched in October 1944, a tacit admission that Japan could no longer compete in conventional aerial combat. The fact that Japan was willing to sacrifice its pilots this way tells you everything you need to know about how completely the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted since Pearl Harbor. And through all of this, the American submarines kept hunting. They hunted in the shipping lanes around Japan. They hunted in the South China Sea. They hunted around the Philippines and in the waters of the Dutch East Indies. They hunted wherever Japanese ships sailed. And the Japanese, try as they might, could not stop them. Their anti-submarine technology was inferior. Their doctrine was inadequate. Their destroyers were skilled but overwhelmed. The American submarines grew bolder and more deadly with every passing month. Let us return now to Commander Enright and the Archerfish, because there is a personal story at the heart of this history that deserves to be told fully. Joseph Enright was born in 1910 in Anacortes, Washington, a small town on Puget Sound. He came from a naval family. His father had served in the Navy. He attended the Naval Academy at Annapolis and graduated in 1933. By the time the war began, he was already an experienced naval officer, but he had not yet found his moment. His earlier command on the Dace had ended with that missed opportunity against a Japanese carrier, and the experience had clearly affected him deeply. He had requested relief from command, which was an unusual and personally painful step. His superiors had recognized that the missed opportunity was not necessarily evidence of poor seamanship or poor judgment, but rather the bad luck that plagues every warrior at some point in his career. They gave him a new command. They gave him the Archerfish. and they gave him another chance. In the months before the Shinano patrol, Enright had been working his crew into a tight, professional fighting team. He ran drills relentlessly. He demanded high standards. He wanted his crew ready, truly ready, for whatever they might encounter. And when the moment came, in the dark hours of November 29th, they were ready. The torpedo attack on the Shinano was textbook in its execution. The approach, the positioning, the firing solution, all of it reflected a crew that knew what they were doing and a commander who had prepared them thoroughly. After the war, Enright was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions on the night of November 28th to 29th, 1944. The citation described the sinking as a masterful coordinated attack conducted under exceedingly difficult conditions. He rose to the rank of Rear Admiral before retiring from the Navy. He died in 2000 at the age of 89, having outlived almost everyone who had served with him on that famous patrol. The men of the Archerfish lived their post-war lives largely in the obscurity that was the common fate of American submariners. Unlike the fighter pilots of the Pacific War or the Marines who had stormed the beaches, submariners operated in secret, their missions classified, their victories often known only to a handful of naval intelligence officers. For years after the war, the crew of the Archerfish could not even discuss what they had done. The full story of the Shinano sinking was not declassified until years after the war ended. When the crew finally could talk about it, many of them found that nobody quite believed them. They had sunk the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, from a submarine only a fraction of the target size, in the middle of the night after a 6-hour chase. It sounded like a war story, the kind that sailors embellish over decades of retelling. But it was true. Every word of it was true. Now let us think about what the Shinano sinking meant in the broader strategic context of the Pacific War. By November 1944, Japan was losing badly. The American island-hopping campaign had reached the Philippines. B-29 bombers were beginning to fly missions against the Japanese home islands from bases in the Mariana Islands. The American submarine campaign had reduced Japan's merchant fleet to a shadow of what it had been. Oil imports had fallen to a fraction of what Japan needed to keep its war machine running. Japan's carrier aviation, which had ruled the Pacific 3 years earlier, had been virtually destroyed at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in which American pilots shot down over 400 Japanese aircraft in 2 days. The Shinano had been conceived as part of a solution to all these problems. A massive, armored carrier that could operate independently, that could survive punishment that would sink any conventional carrier, that could extend Japan's naval reach and perhaps turn the tide. Her loss meant that even this last-ditch hope was gone. Japan would never again be able to mount a credible carrier challenge to American naval supremacy in the Pacific. The remaining Japanese carriers, starved of fuel, starved of experienced pilots, were essentially useless. Some of them were deliberately used as decoys in subsequent operations, their emptiness a measure of how completely Japan's carrier arm had been destroyed. The Shinano sinking also had a profound psychological effect on the Japanese Naval Command. They had believed she was unsinkable, or at least unsinkable by a submarine. The news of her loss was suppressed from the Japanese public for the remainder of the war. Even within the Naval Command, the information was tightly restricted. The shame of losing the largest warship in the world to a single American submarine, of having her go down in less than 8 hours, was almost too humiliating to face. What had gone wrong? How could this have happened? The answers, when they came, were damning. She had gone to sea too soon. Her crew had been inadequately trained. Her watertight integrity had been deficient. Her captain had made the decision to keep moving rather than turn back when the damage became apparent. Every link in a chain of errors had been forged in haste, and haste had killed 1,435 Japanese sailors. For American naval planners, the Shinano sinking was confirmation of something they had suspected but not been entirely certain of. that even the largest and most powerful surface warships were vulnerable to submarine attack if the conditions were right. The lesson reinforced the importance of the American submarine campaign and helped justify the continued allocation of resources to submarine construction and operations. By the end of the war, American submarines had sunk over 1,300 Japanese merchant ships and over 200 Japanese warships, including 8 carriers of various types. The submarine campaign is widely credited by historians as one of the decisive factors in America's victory in the Pacific, perhaps the most important single factor. The Archerfish herself survived the war. After the Shinano patrol, she continued operations in the Pacific, sinking additional Japanese vessels and conducting special operations. She was decommissioned after the war and eventually sold for scrapping in 1968. A small plaque at the Naval Submarine Base New London in Groton, Connecticut, commemorates her service. There is no grand memorial, no museum ship, no monument to mark where the greatest submarine victory in history was planned and executed. Just a plaque and the records and the stories that the surviving crew members told before they, too, were gone. Let us spend some time thinking about the men on the other side. The 1,435 Japanese sailors who died when the Shinano went down. Who were they? What were their stories? They were young men, most of them, many barely out of their teens. They had come from villages and cities across Japan, from fishing families and farm families and merchant families and military families. They had been conscripted into a navy that was fighting a war that was already lost by the time they reported for duty. Many of them had been assigned to the Shinano only weeks before she sailed, given barely time to learn where their battle station was before the ship was gone. Admiral Abe himself, who went down with his ship, had been a career naval officer who had spent his life in service to Japan. He had commanded destroyers and cruisers. He was not a negligent officer or an incompetent one. He was an officer given an impossible assignment, ordered to move an untested ship with an untrained crew through waters where American submarines were known to operate, under time pressure that left no margin for error. The decisions he made to maintain speed, to continue moving rather than turning back, were made in the context of that pressure. He paid for those decisions with his life, along with the lives of more than 1,000 of his men. There is something deeply human about the Shinano story, something that goes beyond the spectacular technical achievement of the Archerfish and her crew. It is a story about the cost of institutional failures, about what happens when organizations are pushed past their limits, when ships are sent to sea before they are ready and crews are sent into battle before they are trained. The Japanese Navy in 1944 was an institution under enormous pressure, making desperate decisions, cutting corners that should never have been cut, paying prices that should never have been paid. The men who died on the Shinano were the ultimate victims of those institutional failures. And yet there is heroism in their story too. The damage control parties who kept fighting to save their ship for 7 hours. The engineers who stayed at their posts as the flooding rose around them. The officers who maintained order as it became clear the ship could not be saved. These men died in the service of a cause that history has judged harshly, but they died with courage, and their courage deserves acknowledgement. The Pacific War was full of moments like this, moments where the technical and the strategic and the human all collided in ways that changed history. The Battle of Midway, where the fate of the war turned on the decisions of a few dive bomber pilots and a Japanese admiral who hesitated at the wrong moment. The assault on Tarawa, where American Marines paid an enormous price to learn lessons that would save lives on later islands. The Doolittle Raid, where 16 B-25 bombers launched from an aircraft carrier to bomb Tokyo, doing little physical damage but enormous psychological damage to Japan's confidence in its ability to protect the home islands. These are the moments that history remembers, and the sinking of the Shinano deserves its place among them. Consider the sheer improbability of what happened that November night. The Archerfish was assigned to a patrol area that just happened to be in the path of the Shinano's transit. The Shinano departed on a night when she was not yet ready for sea. Her captain chose the route that brought him into contact with the Archerfish. His zigzag maneuver, designed to avoid submarines, brought him directly toward one. The American torpedoes hit exactly where they needed to hit. The Shinano's damage control failures ensured that what might have been survivable damage proved fatal. Remove any one of these elements and history changes. The Shinano survives. Perhaps she changes the course of the naval war in the Pacific. Perhaps she helps extend Japan's resistance by months, costing thousands more lives on all sides. Perhaps she is sunk by American aircraft eventually, as the Yamato herself was sunk in April 1945 while making her own final desperate voyage. But she was not sunk by aircraft. She was sunk by a submarine smaller than some of the warehouses her builders worked in. A submarine crewed by 72 men who could barely believe what they had done. A submarine commanded by a man who had failed once before and refused to fail again. The post-war story of the Shinano is in some ways as remarkable as her brief operational career. She sank in water roughly 3,000 feet deep, in an area where the currents and the depths make her extremely difficult to access. For decades, her exact location was uncertain. Japanese and American naval records disagreed on the details. The wreck was not definitively located until 2019, when a Japanese research team using advanced sonar and remotely operated vehicles found her lying on the seabed. The footage they brought back showed a massive shape in the darkness, her flight deck still recognizable, her superstructure collapsed, encrusted with decades of growth, home now to the creatures of the deep sea rather than the sailors who had sailed her. She lies there still, as she will lie for thousands of years, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, her story a permanent part of the history of the sea. The legacy of the Archerfish patrol extends beyond the Shinano herself. It influenced the development of submarine doctrine in the post-war United States Navy. It demonstrated that a single submarine, properly positioned and boldly commanded, could defeat even the mightiest surface vessel. It reinforced the case for the continued development and expansion of the submarine fleet. Today, the United States operates the most powerful submarine force in the world, nuclear-powered, capable of remaining submerged for months at a time, armed with weapons that make the Archerfish's 6 torpedo tubes seem quaint by comparison. But the lineage is direct. The submariners who man those modern boats stand in a tradition that includes Joseph Enright and the crew of the Archerfish. The story of the Archerfish and the Shinano has been told in books and documentaries and naval history journals. But it has never quite received the popular recognition it deserves, perhaps because it happened in the middle of a war that was generating extraordinary stories every day. Perhaps because submarines and their achievements are harder to visualize than the dramatic footage of carrier airstrikes and amphibious landings. Perhaps because the full story was classified for so long that it never made it into the popular consciousness during the years when the war was still fresh in memory. But the story deserves to be known. It deserves to be told completely, with all its complexity and its human dimensions, not just as a tale of technical achievement but as a story about the nature of war itself. About how the best-laid plans go wrong in the face of human error and the accidents of chance. About how desperate innovation, whether it is converting a battleship hull into a carrier or driving a submarine at maximum speed through the night to catch a target that should be too fast to catch, can change the course of history. About how the decisions of individuals, a captain who stays at his post after his ship is mortally wounded, a commander who refuses to miss twice, determine outcomes that affect millions of people. The Pacific War ended on September 2, 1945, when Japan formally surrendered aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. By that point, Japan's military had been destroyed, its cities burned, its people starved and exhausted. The Shinano had been on the bottom for less than a year when the war ended. Her builders, many of them, were still alive to see the defeat they had worked so hard to prevent. The men who had sailed her, those who had survived, came home to a Japan that was occupied, rebuilding, fundamentally changed. The victors came home too. The crew of the Archerfish scattered across America, back to farms and factories and schools and offices, carrying with them the memory of one extraordinary November night when they had done something that nobody thought could be done. Most of them never spoke about it publicly. Most of them lived quiet, ordinary lives in the decades that followed. Their great adventure had lasted a few hours in the middle of a vast ocean, and then it was over, and they were ordinary men again. But history does not forget. History keeps the record, and the record says this. On the night of November 28th to 29th, 1944, in the waters south of Japan's home islands, a submarine called Archerfish sank, the largest warship ever to be sunk by a submarine. The record says that 6 torpedoes were fired, that 4 of them hit, and that the greatest carrier in the world went to the bottom in less than 8 hours. The record says that the commanding officer was a 34-year-old man from Minnesota who had failed once before and refused to fail again. And the record says that his crew, 72 ordinary American men, accomplished something so extraordinary that it stands alone in the long and violent history of naval warfare, a record that has never been broken and a story that deserves to be told as long as there are people left who care about history and the sea and the incredible things that human beings are capable of when everything is on the line. This is the story of the USS Archerfish. This is the story of the Shinano. This is the story of one night in the Pacific War when the greatest ship in the world met the smallest kind of enemy, and the smallest kind of enemy won.